Hello and welcome to this special edition of Political Capital. This is the show where Delhi meets Dalal Street. I'm Vivek Law. While the Narendra Modi government works towards restoring the economy, it also has the daunting task for building investor confidence and reviving the India story for global investors. Today I have with me Shaurya Doval, one of the sharpest minds in the world of finance, who wears the hat of an investment banker, who has worked with top global firms and continues to look into investment initiatives and deal originations in India. He is also director at the India Foundation, a think tank that Prime Minister Narendra Modi listens to very closely. Thank you very much, Shaurya. It's a pleasure talking to you. We've had 30 days of this government, which has come, if I may say so, on a wave of expectations. Some would argue perhaps too much of expectations. Do you think it's on the right track? We did hear his vision for the first time at an event that you all organized back in February. Do you believe it's so far on track?
I think 30 days is too short a time to make a professional assessment. I think we need to see how the budget pans itself out. We need to give a few months as to how the government starts to roll out its programs before really coming to even some kind of an initial assessment.
So let's talk directionally here. What is the kind of a direction that global investors are going to be looking at? Let's talk about the budget. You talked about that big event coming up in the next few days. What would your expectations be, or the expectations of people who you speak to in your fraternity? What is the expectation?
I think first thing that they are looking at is policy clarity and ease in complexity. I think they want to understand what indeed is the policy, and the policy should be clear, it should be comprehensible, and it should be consistent. So that's the first thing that they're starting to look at, starting from the first policy announcement, some of which may be reflected in the budget, and then in the subsequent months that follow. So that's, I think, the first point that the investors are looking at. The second thing that they are looking at is that how will the execution challenges, how will this policy translate itself into execution on the ground? The prior few years of investors, the boat has been rocked less on policy but more on execution of things. So they want to see that the new administrative machinery, the new the new government, and through their administrative mechanism, are actually able to indeed translate this policy into execution. So execution challenges is the second thing that they are looking at. Third thing that I think they are looking at, which was talked a lot about in the Indian elections and became a big issue, and I think this government particularly will be very focused on it, is this issue of corruption and nepotism. Because if you look at it, this third factor distorts the first two in terms of the possible outcomes, and so therefore creates a delta which you cannot then correlate between policy and execution, because if corruption and nepotism come, then the outcomes become very different. So I think that's the third thing that they will be looking to see, that is there indeed a change in that aspect, in terms so that they can feel comfortable that the policy and the execution will be consistent and consistent outcomes will come. The fourth one is judicial activism and judicial clarity. For investors anywhere in the world, enforcement of contract and timely enforcement of contract is the cornerstone of any investment. You cannot invest in geographies and you cannot invest in countries or companies where you cannot enforce contracts. Now, I know that the executive powers are limited in being able to do that, but if the investments in India have to sort of succeed and sustain on a consistent basis, we need to see timely judicial enforceability. Sure, people will have differences of opinions, difference of views, but these must resolve in timely manner, whether it's between the states and the private players, between the banks and the private players, or between the center and the state. It has to be a judicial consistency and clarity in that. So that's the thing. And then finally, I think that investors will be looking at sort of more tactical things like labor reforms, exchange rate, maintaining of the exchange rate. So I think these are the 5-6 fundamental things that the investors will be looking at as from the government. as they start to come back into India as a long-term investment destination.
Do you believe that informed investors, such as you and the ones who are really moving money from overseas, they are willing to give this government some more time and they're more keen on seeing a directional change? For example, let's talk about this whole fiscal deficit issue. The Prime Minister, the Finance Ministers have already started tempering expectations. We've had statements coming out saying the coffers are empty. At the same time, there is that commitment to whatever has already been committed. So they are not in a very easy situation, right? Would informed investors be okay saying, all right, it's okay, you may not get to 4.1, you may get to XYZ, whatever the number may be, as long as we see a roadmap? Do you believe that's the way global investors are going to see this budget?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think within the informed investors, you must sort of break between the long-term investors and the short-term investors. The long-term investors are only looking for, in my view at least, are looking for directional clarity at this stage from the government. They do know that the government is new, it will take time for it to stabilize, for it to chart out a sort of a course for itself. That charting out that course requires involving stakeholders, thinking through the issues. If you've got to put long-term architecture in place, it is equally dangerous to put it in a rush, And I think, on the contrary, if they were actually to do things like that, it would actually scare long-term investors like myself, because it would actually mean that they haven't dwelled on it long enough and they haven't thought through all the issues, and therefore there is an increased risk of this either getting tripped further down the process, whether in legal hassles or other issues. And therefore, I think the long-term investor, the informed investor, really at this stage, I think, wants to see a demonstration of intent. It need not necessarily wants to see all policy clarity in the first budget, but definitely wants to see a directional intent of the new government.
Let's talk about a couple of directional intents then, which would be on top of a lot of global investors' mind like yours. The whole retrospectivity bit. This government, in the run-up to the election, in its manifesto said that it's against retrospectivity. A lot of its senior officials have come out and said that. The Attorney General of India told me in a recent interview that if it were left to me, I would just repeal it and put an end to this. Do you believe that when you say directional, it's that kind of a statement which will assure investors that this government means business?
Without getting into specifics,
I'm not talking about the case, I'm talking about the principle. I think global investors are upset with the principle of retrospectivity, not whether X company or Y company got taxed.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what I'd earlier said. Clarity and consistency. Consistency is an important aspect for planning any investments. Every sovereign is free to frame the rules under which it would wish any investor or any private participant to play. But having framed the rules, what investors or what participants would not feel very comfortable if you start changing the goalposts. So, if a government does in all its wisdom decide that indeed this is the policy, then that's fine. But then it should have the consistency. And retrospective taxes, by their very nature, show that there is lack of it's a contradiction in itself. There is a lack of consistency. So you are absolutely right. Investors definitely need, in any geography that they invest, consistency in policies. Because, as I said, without consistencies, it's impossible to plan your investments.
So here's a new government which has come with such a strong mandate. Should it not undo the past and say, let's start afresh, this was a mistake, let's just get on and put an end to this whole sentiment issue, genuine issue in terms of investors?
See, I think I think too much is being read into this issue. It should do something like that. Not in a position to say what they will do.
No, I'm not asking what they do. I'm saying, would you like them to do that?
What I would
You've had strong views on that
I
in the
think
past.
what has happened is passé. What I would like to see, or I think what investors would be seeing, is that here onwards, whatever they do, they take the time to think through it. They don't go to the town making policy statements or giving directional statements unless they have thought through the whole gamut of issues, both in policy perspectives, but even in its execution challenges. So, for example, we are starting to hear this noise about FDI in defense or FDI in railways. Now, this is very interesting. And again, as an FDI investor, this is an area where infrastructure investors would like to invest. But before the government actually comes out and engages with the media and sort of with all the players, it must clearly, for once, make up its view. Where does it want to end up? Must think through what is the issues that might crop up in the sort of the constitutional legal framework of India. Must debate this with all stakeholders to bring around consensus, including the participants, to make them stakeholders and the investors stakeholders in this issue, and then come out with a comprehensive policy with very meticulously laid out milestones that would be achieved, and then hold itself publicly accountable in achieving those milestones. It is when that happens that investors will feel that things have changed in Delhi. That actually now you have a government that clearly identifies the objectives, sets policies, sets targets, whereby it benchmarks itself against targets, and then constantly keeps them in the public domain to evaluate performances, so that there is constant pressure on all parties to be able to deliver together to those milestones. Otherwise, what happens is that, this is what sort of Nani Palkhiwala had written in his book many years ago, that, official proclamations in Delhi are like a rainmaker's pronouncement during a rain. They're not expected to change anything, but they're expected to give an impression that, God is thinking about it. Those kind of things, I think, are sort of, today's world, in fast-moving world, if you look at sort of the capital flows in the world today, it's only been in the last decade that money has moved and capital flows have become more important than trade flows. Even till mid-90s, capital was essentially a very local investment phenomenon. US capital pretty much stayed in US, Japanese capital. It's only in the last 10 years that capital moves at the push of a button. It moves in and it moves out, based upon the opportunities it offers. In a world where we are living, where we are going to be competing for global capital, we are going to be competing in a capital-constrained world, it is very, very important that India sends out messages of credibility, of consistency, and deliverability. All these three things is what will make investors come and, more importantly, stay in India.
Do you believe that there is a large amount of capital sitting out there which is yet to come into India and is likely to come if those right directions are made?
So I look at it this way, and I'll break that question into two. I have often wondered that a lot of debate in India typically focuses upon attracting capital. While this is important, that's not the full story. Investors invest to make returns. I think the part of the discourse should be that how will we give investors returns on investments? Because it is only when investors, you don't win the battle, you only win 30% of the battle when investors invest in you. Actually, you win this battle when investors actually get a return out of their investments. The last decade has not been something that, India has been a very attractive investment destination from a long-term investment perspective, And much of what I'm saying is from the perspective of what I call as the FDI investment, which is the 5-year, the 10-year money. I'm not talking about sort of the more FII kind of investment, which has much more flexibility in terms of moving in and out. So I think the first important point is that I think that the first part is that will India be able to give investors attractive investor returns? If that is the case, and investors are convinced about it, and investors, as I said, see demonstration of that in reality, then yes, there will be money that will come into India. There is now, will there be lots of pools of capital? India definitely needs a huge amount of pool of capital to come into India. I personally think that we are in a capital constraint world. We are not in the world that we were in the early 2000s. when there was excess liquidity in the world. This is a world where there is liquidity is constrained. Certain pockets in the world are emerging as exceedingly attractive investment destinations. India will have to go out there and compete for that capital. And India can only compete for that capital if India offers investment returns which are higher than those geographies. Personally, I think India can give that kind of return. But as I said, those 5 or 6 things, all ducks need to be lined up for us to be able to not only invest, but actually generate those returns to keep coming back and investing in India.
I want to touch on 2 of those 5 issues that you talked about, Shaurya. One was the fact that, let's look at the reality of the last 10 years. There were billions and billions in dollars worth of projects that were stuck. Now, many approvals did come through in the last year and a half, but the fact is, no economic activity has happened on those projects since then. There was also a large chunk of these projects which have been stuck in litigation. And if we go into tax litigation, both direct and indirect, that number just swells. How do you think this government can go about kick-starting the investment cycle? Isn't that, and it ties into the point you made about the returns, because if I come in as a global investor, I put in money, the sector is not moving or the company is not moving because it's stuck somewhere. Is that the big issue that needs to be dealt with?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, if you scan the world today, there is hardly any serious investor in the world who has not taken an exposure to India in some form or the other. If he has not taken an exposure to India, he is most likely not an investor who's sort of significant. They may have taken small exposure to India, but they indeed have taken exposure to India. Those investments are stuck. It is very difficult. Think about it as your own human psychology. It's very difficult to ask an investor to come back into a geography and invest with their purses open on a promise when the past performance does not resonate with the future promise. You have to see progress on these projects first for people to start believing that yes, the newer opportunities are going to be attractive for India. I think many of these are not stuck, and as you rightly said, on policy issues. There is no policy conflict. They are issued in what was my second point, in the execution challenges. Some of them may be legislative, some of them may be legal, but many of them are pure execution challenges that have got compounded because legal issues have been added onto that. I myself invest in these projects. I'm a big investor, and I know that they are not beyond the realm of solving, but it does require a very, very focused, determined, and both political and administrative involvement at the nitty-gritty level to try and solve these.
You're also a chartered accountant, so let me ask you this. Do you believe in the word tax terrorism, and do you believe that it's gained so much of magnitude that that could be one of the big areas that could be fixed?
Absolutely. I think that I wouldn't go to the extent of calling it tax terrorism, because I've actually seen that in the last few years, indeed, before I sort of come to my complaint, that indeed that the Indian tax administration and tax sort of regime has improved on many, many counts. The fact that they've got electronic and they've got technology, etc. Some of them have been positive developments. But indeed, one phenomenon has come, which has been a bit disturbing, and to which investors have been at the receiving ends. And you've seen cases from the likes of Nokia, and you've seen Vodafone issue, and there's Shell had an issue, where we see that the tax machinery has become a sort of a sovereign on its own, and because of the power that it commands, it has been able to pin down huge investments, even though sometimes they may have legitimate reasons, in a manner that the whole, in being able to extract the tax, we've sort of lost the whole plot. We want people, the companies that come and invest here, to pay taxes. They must follow the rule of the law. But these companies pay taxes everywhere else in the world. And whenever they do, and that they do avoid taxes in other parts of the world, and they are caught, they are penalized, and they apologize, and they make up that. India is no different. So I think this One aspect of this is that, one aspect is that indeed the tax department will have to bring about consistency and clarity in how they deal with these companies. There was a good proposal, I believe, that, which is sort of moving the Indian tax system to what they call as a faceless taxation. It's a very smart idea, which is effectively saying that now that companies have become highly sophisticated, the taxman also needs to become extremely sophisticated. You can't have the local assessing officer assess if Nokia's sale is indeed an export or not an export, what you need are high degree of domain specialists within the tax department that can actually assess on issues of transfer pricing, on valuation of shares and capital gains in industries across sectors. But we need to give clarity to companies and investors about what the laws are. And if there is a violation of law, then to consistently enforce them, both on domestic companies and foreign companies on a consistent basis. And then I think the tax authorities and the government could do also a positive thing by giving their side of the story. You see, the other thing is perception management, which has again done some disservice to the investment climate, because honestly, we've only heard one side of the story. Because that's the only side that's represented. What is the government's view? Government typically only comes out with orders and with injunctions and with penalties. What it doesn't explain very clearly that what was the basis, what indeed was the case, and which also does great disservice to the investment climate, because then you only hear the story of the victim. Informed investors don't necessarily always look at outcomes. They also look at the process through which those outcomes are arrived. And when those outcomes become either opaque or distorted because of issues like corruption and nepotism, which is what I was telling earlier, then people start losing faith in the process. If we have to make India an attractive investment climate, we have to be less concerned about giving initial outcomes, because those might actually, as I said, attract investors for a short period of time. You might see another euphoria extended for 3 months, 6 months. But if you really want investors to come and stay, you've got to give them belief and faith and in the credibility of your process.
You're bullish India?
I'm extremely bullish India. I'm actually extremely bullish.
Okay, it's great talking to you, Shaurya, and I will talk to you again once we've heard the budget speech. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you.